and welcome to the first ever episode of B2Z Gap. This is Zach Humphreys here. I'm with my uncle Bob Humphreys, and we're first and foremost just going to introduce ourselves and tell you a little bit about ourselves, and then we're going to get into how we're going to help you and add value to your day in this life of podcasting. So, Uncle Bob, I'll turn it over to you to just kind of introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Bob Humphreys, and I have been a college professor for the better part of over 30 years. I started 10 years adjunct and then had 21 years and ended in retirement, although I'm teaching adjunct now, and as an associate professor of psychology. I work as a psychologist, so I can bring lots of things about people and interactions to you and talk about those things. And I think what else I bring to all of this will be a little bit about being born at the tail end of the baby boom and give you some perspective from, and maybe hope to show you that our generations really don't see things that much differently, although we may talk about them in different kinds of ways. At least I would hope that would be what we would accomplish. As this started off as a very impromptu kind of thing. Zach's cousin was getting married, came to stay with us, although we were COVID quarantined, came to stay with us during those troubling times. But we sat down the day that he arrived and just started talking and thought, gee, this would be a great opportunity for us to discuss issues and talk about things together and share those with people who might be interested in hearing what we have to say.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that it's just kind of happened organically. And I really wish we could have just recorded that discussion, and that could have been episode 1.
As much as we jumped topics, it could have been episodes 1 through 14, because we talked a little bit about everything and anything as we were going through. Right. I'm not sure what else I would add to that, except that we found what we were doing to be very interesting. We looked at our viewpoints. We tried to see the commonalities. We certainly elicited differences from each other. And we just had a lot of fun and thought maybe this would be a worthwhile thing to bring. Zach is a young college professor, and myself now as a retired college professor. And we'll have some thoughts, some different kinds of thoughts about some things. I would think as we approach different topics, we would hope that as we move forward, we get a little better at doing these things and get a little bit more proficient at what we attempt to do. Zach and I actually have so much in common because my interest, part of my draw to psychology was because I had always been interested in communication of one kind or another, and had an opportunity when I was younger to do and be involved in. I was part of a production team that produced a weekly television program on our local television station. And so communication has always been kind of in my purview, although probably much more avocationally for me than Zach has been. Did a little DJing in college, have done some local radio things here as a guest and being an expert in some areas. So hopefully you'll get a flavor that, again, we do have probably more in common than most people would recognize as we go through.
Yeah, and I think it's important too that you mentioned that we also have some differences. And I think in our world today, it's so important to discuss those things. I mean, because I think we live in a society where it can feel like, at least, that you have to kind of associate with people who only agree with everything you say, right? And it's kind of this world we live in social media. And I don't want to give too much away, because that's going to be one topic we'll address, and one that I get a little amped up about, because that's why I'm probably already previewing it. But yeah, and I think it's super important. I think to have discussions where there even are points of maybe not even disagreement, just coming at it from different perspectives, and hence the name B2Z. Spanning 30 years and over many generations, we're going to come at a lot of these topics and a lot of these big topics in our world, and talk about it from different perspectives and different generations. And I think our goal is to eventually, even when we maybe do disagree on something, to find common ground. And I think that's also important.
I think sometimes today, I think differences sometimes are met with, I have to convince the other side to take my perspective.
Right.
And in that process, I think sometimes we stop listening to each other. I know that as a psychologist who sometimes does marriage therapy, we find that happening in the marital arena. I think, and I want to approach this somewhat cautiously, different is different. And seeing things from a different perspective doesn't make it better or worse. It just means that we see it differently. Certainly in some of the things that, if we were to oversimplify some of the distinctions, and I don't want to give too much away, but in political arena, just as an example, I think that particularly in the two-party system, we have different priorities. It's the same pot of money, and it's who moves what where to cover what and when, and based on what they promise their constituency is their particular priority at a given time. And it's interesting because it's the same pot of money, and it shifts. And it does become sometimes politicized, I think, at least in terms of an observational standpoint from what I've seen, because, this party doesn't care about this issue, when basically they probably do care about that issue. They just prioritize how much money it gets differently than the other party. I don't think we've never stopped funding programs for the other party. We do more to move money and allocations. Those other things don't ever go out of existence entirely, at least not from the perspective of somebody that's seen a lot of elections over a period of time. Those things are still present, and those things are still around, although they may have less of a budget, they may have less personnel, they may be doing more with less. But isn't that the model that we see in business oftentimes? We have to learn to do more with less. We have to reinvent ourselves when business isn't doing what it needs to be. And so when we look at that, it's just a shift in priority and a shift in money. And again, it depends on how passionately you feel about the money being spent. The way that you would like to see spent as to probably how vigorously we object or we adhere to what somebody else has to say.
Right, and that's a perfect segue into our first episode as a teaser. We're going to talk about the election and so many things to unravel and to talk about. And what our goal is really here is just to add value to other people's lives. And so many people have more time on their hands, and a lot of people thought radio was dead, but here we are, just another form of radio with a visual element, perhaps, but. During this podcast, we really want to spark a conversation. We want to interest you in ways and make you think in ways that maybe you hadn't thought of, and maybe ways that you had thought of. That makes you say, "Wow, okay, somebody else, has that same feeling." but yeah, so many different angles of the election that we're going to get to. Do you want to tease any of those angles?
I, as I was going through the list and obviously you did most of the prep on this list, I thought, boy, we started off very boldly to talk about the election, because I think some of this is still unraveling and some of this is still unfolding. And, we have a sitting president who has um, not really conceded. We and I'm not sure that that's completely unprecedented, and it's probably very consistent with what he said that he was going to do. I'm not going to be a career politician. I'm going to be different. I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to defy the conventional wisdom. Okay. At the very least, although we might disagree on this, we could say that he's consistent in that. And again, I think we have differences of opinion. I'm taken by the fact that here in Ohio, in the heartland, we have prided ourselves to being a state that, as the state has gone, the election outcome has gone. And this is the first time since 1960, which again really dates even me, but it's the first time since 1960 that Ohio didn't vote consistently with the outcome of the election. And so it's kind of a weird split. And where you and I grew up in Trumbull County, of all places, Trumbull County, which was a very dyed-in-the-wool, very democratic stronghold, they predominantly voted Republican, and it almost flew in the face of what you would expect to see. Whereas other larger major metropolitan areas that also had industrial base seemed to go traditionally in the way of the Democrats. Somehow Trumbull County didn't do that. And I'm still trying to process all of that and read as much as I can read and understand that better, because it's a glitch. It doesn't fit with what we have oftentimes seen here. And so, if anything, and then maybe you and I would disagree on this, I don't know, but it certainly has changed the complexion of what we're used to seeing. And certainly goes against the grain of what prognosticators and pollsters and all the other folks had been saying about the way things go. It's a weird and unusual circumstance.
Yeah, speaking of those particular counties, we saw that shift in 2016 too. There was a big shift there. So perhaps there is something to Donald Trump's message to those people, to maybe even that area of the country. At least in 2016, you saw, states like Michigan and Wisconsin go the other way, go toward the way of Trump. So, and then that begs the question: Did he lose something in those areas? What happened? What transpired over those 4 years? Or I'm sure there's other variables at play, but I think what's another fascinating element of this entire election, and we'll get at this a lot more in episode 1, is just voter turnout. I mean, if you look just for like a bipartisan, kind of nugget, I mean, just to say that regardless, just by going to the number of votes, either candidate would have had the most votes, I think, ever recorded. I'm not 100% on that, but I'm almost positive.
It surprises me, because I think when in the last election, the two previous election cycles, when we were electing President Obama president, we had this large voter turnout that was unprecedented, and we saw people pouring out to the polls. And when people were looking at these two candidates, what was surprising was the number of people that turned out at the polls. This would not have been a ticket that you think would have drawn. And sometimes you got to wonder about the conjecture of, uh, you know, was Donald Trump originally elected as an anti-Hillary vote, or did some part of his rhetoric get old, and the folks that had traditionally voted for him had just had enough of the rhetoric? And it's interesting. Almost every president, and I live in Canton, Ohio, and so now, and Canton, Ohio is the home of William McKinley, and every president uh, that's been elected has captured the medium of the time. And so, and William McKinley had that big, deep baritone voice and would project into these halls, and so he was elected. Um, John F. Kennedy and people like Ronald Reagan embraced the camera and the television media. John F. Kennedy was probably more eloquent as a speech maker. I think he did a lot in terms of just being able to speak to people. Ronald Reagan could look into the camera and you thought he was talking to you. When it comes to President Clinton, he was the first presidential candidate to ever appear on MTV at a time when MTV was the medium of the moment. And so, and then we look at someone like Donald Trump, who has his own Twitter account that has been very active during his entire political time in office. And you begin to think that somehow this idea that every president captures the medium of the moment, that there's really something to that message, and there's something about that. I'm not sure how history is going to remember certain presidents, and if they're all going to be remembered to being connected to some medium. But those examples stand out, at least in terms of, well, probably just as I was being born, and through the time that I have been a party to and able to acknowledge and look at presidential elections. Just to share with you, just a thought. Bob Dole, after he lost his bid for the presidency, appeared on David Letterman. And he was humorous and he was funny and he was engaging. And I thought, his handlers did this all wrong, because had he appeared on Letterman before the election and people would have seen that he wasn't such a stiff, I'm not trying to be partisan, I'm not trying to do any of those kind of things, but he might have been elected president in that election. Again, I think we hadn't seen that side of him before. And so there are messages that occur within the media about person's character. We have the political pundits who control how they do their rhetoric. And I think, Donald Trump set out to be in contrast to that. And that was a part of what made him electable, I think, the first time through. I'm not so sure that the message was as resoundingly received the second time through.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. I think you bring up a lot of good points with, speaking to Kennedy, and a lot of people would point to that was the first televised debate. A lot of people would point to that's why he won, because he dominated television. And for those people who had watched the debate on TV, overwhelmingly said that he did a better job than Nixon.
Nixon had two things against him. Nixon was not a particularly attractive person.
Right.
And Nixon, for all that he did, was not necessarily the orator
right.
that JFK was. And I think Nixon came back into the presidency later, but I think his opponent was much different than Kennedy had been. So it was a different kind of an election cycle um, when you start looking at it from that perspective.
Yeah, and I think if you flash forward then to Obama in 2008, if you look at that time, that was when Facebook was becoming the powerhouse as we know it today.
Hmm.
That's when all the organic growth was occurring with Facebook. And he absolutely dominated that platform. A lot of people would say that, his message of hope and change resonated so much and with so many people on that specific platform. YouTube as well. He was very big on YouTube, which at the time it was just 3 years in the making. So this medium was new. People were fascinated with it. They were on it, and so was he. And a lot of people would say that's why he won. And I think with Trump, he's chose to use Twitter as his vehicle, which I think is interesting because, and along with Obama using Facebook, what's something that's new with social media is you can really, in some ways, bypass the gatekeepers of the media. You don't have to go through these traditional gates, right? To say, hey, I need this journalist to get this story out. He can get his own story out, right? And that goes for anybody. But the fact that Trump had kind of utilized that as a vehicle to bypass the press and even, push back on the press and say that, I don't need you. I have my own platform. And I think we've seen that, in the day of social media, in the age of social media in politics, and we're going to continue to see that.
It's interesting to me because of all of the different kinds of ways that we reach each other. I don't think we've ever had a presidential candidate that reached out to people through iTunes, and that surprises the heck out of me because at one time it was the medium, and it was the big thing that everybody wanted to jump on the bandwagon of.
Right.
You know, and no, I don't think we had anybody doing anything to iTunes at that time. You gotta wonder sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I don't want to give too much away because we've already kind of gotten into into our main topic, but I guess I'll tease a few other just general topics that we'll eventually get into. Just generational differences as a whole, and just talking about coming from certain eras and certain periods of time and how that kind of made you see the world and how you make sense of things. Another big topic we'll get into is how social media, speaking of the gift and the devil, as I like to call it, it's a double-edged sword, is psychologically influencing different generations. And I think that'll be a fascinating topic because you've got people now today that are growing up and all they've ever known was Google and Facebook and Instagram and all these things where I guess I'm somewhere in the middle of all that, and then you take it back a few generations. So that'll be a fascinating one.
It's interesting to me because I think I'm of a point in my life where some of these things have been moving so quickly and so fast. And it's interesting because Facebook seems to be now the medium of people at the tail end of the baby boom,
right,
and those that followed.
Right.
And younger people are gravitating to other platforms in different kinds of ways. It would be interesting to see if TikTok will have an influence on the next presidential election. I'm just absolutely. You were thinking the same thing?
I'm telling you. It was literally just coming to my head. It very well could.
Yeah, that's too funny.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that was perfect. That was perfect. You have to be able to laugh, and I think as we move down on some of the other topics, we're gonna talk about some of the kinds of benefits that we see from psychotherapy, and I think that we're finding more and more, particularly with the isolation that occurs with COVID that's going on right now. People are really despite the social media, we're not as connected as we need to be. We're seeing higher levels of anxiety. We're seeing people not really feeling as connected as they need to be. We see whole areas of the psychological literature beginning to shift. We used to vilify stress, and stress is not vilified anymore. And we're looking at the value of some stress hormones. Not that we want to put ourselves into more stress, but if we learn to move with those stress hormones, perhaps we're going to be able to gain some things. And we have to be able to laugh together. We have to be able to share together. We have to be able to talk to each other and connect. And it's interesting, in an age where we had some Ivy League schoolers not able to get out of their dorm room long enough to talk to each other, who invent a platform to be able to talk to each other. And some people would even go back so far as college used to be about that interaction, being able to interact and do those things. And then we see college campuses now where people are isolated in their rooms playing video games, and they're not doing the connection. And we're even catering now. We have people that are competing on things like EA Sports and doing those kinds of things. And like, it's still a video game the last time I checked, and it's supposed to be entertainment, but somehow it's taken on a different quality, at least for some students. So then we require the social media to be able to get connected. And again, it's kind of changed. We used to go out and see each other. We used to go out and do things together. We used to, and there's still some of those things, but I think the social media also allows us to connect in different kinds of ways. You know, you and I have some distance apart. I mean, if I see something that you post on Instagram, and I'm following you on Instagram, it gives me an opportunity to be a participant with you in something. And the same for me with Facebook, to people that I allow to have access to my Facebook account. And so it does provide opportunities, but it's not the whole shebang. It's not, we want to talk to each other. We want to be able to connect to each other. We want to be able to feel that sense of connection with each other.
Definitely. You know, as an aside, I want to ask you something, and I'm pretty ignorant to this, but somebody sent me a link today that kind of speaks to this day and age that we live in social media. And it was a link to high social media usage and narcissism, and kind of how that, and I know that's probably like a heavy topic that's researched a lot in psychology and a lot of threads, but is there a connection between that and this level of isolation, do you think? I mean, is there a connection there?
I don't know. It gets to be a little baffling, and you and I may want to do some individual research and take a look at this together, but and talk about it in one of our podcasts. But it occurs to me that this is not the first time that we've heard this kind of stuff. We talked about a generation of people being the me generation at one point. We talk about the fact that now most of us have a camera on our phones, and we snap pictures of everything, and we depict a life. You know, I talked to somebody the other day, and I said, "Oh, you look like you're having a really wonderful life," and they said, "Oh, that's just my Facebook life. That's not my real life." And I'm like, "What's that?"
That's a problem. I mean,
that is a problem.
That they're going through struggle. You only see the great and the good, and then other people scrolling who are going through maybe some turmoil and some mental health issue. All they see is all these people having a great time, and then they start saying, "Well, I'm not having as great of a time as that person." And
but some people have begun to use some of this a little differently. So I'm not sure that it's entirely as narcissistic as people would make out. I learned that this very same person said that I learned that her husband had COVID from a Facebook posting, which is very frightening because they've got a new child, and she's working in an environment where she's exposed to lots of different people. And so I think the magnitude of that sense of crisis is obviously important too. Um, just got a social media post on Facebook. Um, Friends of ours, the one gal's mom had been in an run down by an automobile, and we've been getting updates on a pretty routine basis. And our group of friends are texting basically what's been cut out of Facebook and posted on Facebook, and they've been texting it in a text chain. In addition to, because not everybody has Facebook apparently, and so there's something to be said, because we now are starting to communicate more about some of the perils of things. And we may be getting a more realistic feel about some of the things that people are going through at times. But it also begs the question, how do you have privacy with those medium? And so there is not a lot of privacy unless you self-select and filter what you're going to do. It's very difficult to have that sense of things.
Yeah, I had a discussion today with a former professor of mine, and we're going to get into the topic of social media algorithms too. And he's been looking at these algorithms for a long, long time. And I asked him today about this issue of our First Amendment, which we'll probably address at some point too, and how that kind of is different in terms of what you can say in a face-to-face encounter on the street, and what you can say on Facebook or on Twitter. It's kind of this it's kind of an interesting, I guess, dichotomy in that they're private companies, but they have so much power, and they have so much influence. But the internet is a public space, so there's a lot of different variables at play that make it really hard to tackle these big questions. But we're gonna do our best when it comes to privacy and algorithms. But
The interesting thing to me is that the flexibility of our Constitution is going to be tested, I think, as we begin to look critically at these issues at the level of the federal courts and the Supreme Court, and looking at those kinds of things. And there have been lots of solutions that have been proposed to different kinds of issues and different kinds of problems that have come up. And it occurs to me that sometimes we just don't have, it's not a black and white answer, and it's not a crystal clear answer. And we have to be able to go back to the origins of some of those things. I mean, much of the freedoms that were established, particularly in the First Amendment, had to do and surround religious freedom. And yet, Facebook, in not allowing certain religious beliefs to be depicted, flies in the face of the very underlying reason that the First Amendment was in place. And so no one would have guessed, when all of these things were first established, that we would be communicating in such different ways. You know, it's a weird glitch. I'm going to give you a little geek thing here, okay? But there was these two separate researchers at one point in time gave a theory of emotion, and they both published at about the same time, and they came out in about the same time in two separate places, and neither knew each other, and so they began to call it the James Lang theory. Now, some people assume that James was the guy's first name, but it was the one researcher's last name, and Lang was the other one, and they called it the James Lang theory. Today, that wouldn't happen, because we have checks and ways of looking at research and computer technology that we were missing in that era. But so it wouldn't happen today. But sometimes I think the issues that come out of the fast-paced changes that take place have certainly brought about questions that fly in the face of how some of these things were established from a constitutional standpoint.
yeah, there's no way that they could have forecasted this,
Oh,
right?
no, no.
To have that foresight. There is one guy in communication who had some interesting foresight. Maybe if they would have listened back in 1960, there was a guy by the name of Marshall McLuhan,
Yeah,
and
oh, yeah.
he was a technological determinist who basically said, hey, the global village is coming. We're all going to be interconnected. And that was in 1960. That was pretty astounding that he developed that idea. But
I remember taking a college class, and the famous quote that was attributed to him in my class was, "The medium is the message."
right.
And
It's
boy,
I still try to tackle that. It's a great quote. Great quote.
it absolutely is. And again, it ties into some of the things that we've teased a little bit today when we were talking about embracing the medium of the time of presidential candidates. I think he is correct. It is the message. It's the whole enchilada in some instances.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're gonna end it there. This has been episode 0 of B2Z Gap. Thank you all so much, and we can't wait to continue this. And we will be back next week with episode 1, talking about the election. So we will see you then.
Take care.